So, welcome everyone. Good evening. My name is Annemarijn Epker and I am a program editor at the Bali. This evening, we are delighted to welcome Harvard's psychologist and linguist Steven Pinker here in the Bali tonight. Steven Pinker is one of the most influential and optimistic thinkers of our time. I would also like to welcome the audience here in the Bali and the people who are watching online from home. Steven Pinker became famous all over the world after the publication of his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, in 2011. Later on, in 2018, he wrote a follow-up to this book, which is called Enlightenment Now. In his books, Pinker provides a very optimistic view on human history. He demonstrates with an impressive amount of facts and figures how history and how human history has improved over time. And actually, he shows that the world has become a much better place. Instead of what many people seem to feel and seem to think nowadays, human life is becoming globally safer, is becoming healthier, is longer, more prosperous, better educated, and more tolerant, and these are only a few examples that he gives in the book. You could say that this is actually the perfect story to listen to on an evening, on a day as today, because here in the Netherlands, we are finding ourselves in the midst of a second wave of a pandemic. So, Steven, as you might understand, we are longing for some positive stories here tonight. I'm really happy you're here. So tonight we will discuss the issue of human progress in light of COVID-19. So what does the current crisis mean for our future? Is there still something to be optimistic about? And how can we explain the reactions to this crisis from a psychological perspective? Tonight, we will start with a keynote by Steven Pinker, where he will address the issues of this evening. And after that, we will have an interview. Following this, there is room for questions from the audience here in the Bali who came live, which is really great. So there is time for that as well. And then around 9:15, we will wrap up the conversation and leave it there. But before we begin listening to you, Professor Pinker, I'm very curious to hear, how are you doing? Where are you now? And what are the circumstances?
I'm one of the lucky ones. I still have my job as a professor. I am sheltering in a beautiful part of the world, namely Cape Cod off the coast of Massachusetts. So I can't complain about myself, although I am well aware of all of the suffering that other people in my country and in the world are now undergoing.
Because you're doing all your lectures online now, or do you sometimes see someone in person?
No one in person. I'm all Zoom all the time.
Oh my God. So yes, we're really happy that you're here tonight, and we will listen to your short presentation.
Thank you. The case that I have made for progress, I like to say, is not a case for optimism. It's not a question of seeing the world through rose-colored glasses or seeing the glasses half full, because that's an attitude. The case that I'm making is really one of data, facts about the world that most people are just unaware of, because our view of the world comes from journalism, from the news, and news reports what goes wrong. It's a non-random sample of everything that's gone wrong in the previous day, and that's simply not only because bad news sells, but simply it's in the nature of what journalism does, namely reporting events. It's easier for something to go wrong very subtly than to go right. A lot of good news consists of nothing happening. If a country is at peace, that's great news. But on the other hand, it's not news, because you never see a headline that says such and such a country has not been attacked by terrorists or is not fighting a war. And so unless you look at data, your view of the world can be out of sync with reality. And what I've tried to do, I'm not the only one, is to present a picture of the world based in data. And it does show that progress is a real phenomenon that people are unaware of. I'll just give my favorite examples. Through most of human history, life expectancy at birth was about 30 years. Now the global average is more than 71, and in developed countries, it's greater than 80. Poverty. Through most of human history, poverty was the natural state of humanity. 200 years ago, 90% of the world lived in what we would today classify as extreme poverty. That has fallen to 9%. We are born illiterate. Through most of the history of Europe, about 15% of the population could read and write, a clerical and aristocratic elite. Today, 80% of the world can read and write, 90% of the world under the age of 30, and girls as well as boys. It used to be that only boys were educated. Now the world is very close to gender parity. Peace, the natural state of relations between empires and great powers, used to be war, and peace was just an interlude between wars. We're living through the what's sometimes called the long peace, the absence of war between the world's biggest countries. And even if you count deaths from civil wars, which are the wars that take place now, the total toll has fallen from the late 40s of about 20 per 100,000 per year to less than 1 per 100,000 per year. Human rights, for the first time in history, a majority of the world's countries are more democratic than autocratic, and a majority of the world's population lives in countries that are more democratic than autocratic. Now, of course, there have been severe threats to democracy. We've read about Russia and Turkey and Hungary, and perhaps most terrifyingly to me is my adopted country of the United States. And so democracy is clearly under threat. On the other hand, when I was younger, the world only had 30 democracies. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. Spain and Portugal were fascist dictatorships. Latin America was under the control of military juntas. East Asian countries like Taiwan and South Korea and Indonesia were all under military dictatorships, and they're all democratic today. Women can vote in every country in which men can vote, except one, Vatican. And country after country has abolished capital punishment, criminalization of homosexuality, apartheid laws. Child labor has been in decline. There's still, as with all of these data, by the way, there's still far too much of them. For something to decline is not to say that it's disappeared, but it has declined. Child labor has been in decline, and contrary to a widespread opinion that we're living through an epidemic of suicide, suicide worldwide has fallen by about 40% in the last 30 years. The United States is an exception. Suicide rates have risen in the United States. One of many ways, I should add, in which the United States is a backward country compared to its rich democracies. So this leads to the question, given that all of these data show that until this year, at least, the world has been making progress. This is not optimism. This is not seeing the glass as half full. These are just facts. Is progress inevitable? And the crucial thing to realize is absolutely not. There is no force that just makes life better and better. Quite the contrary. The universe doesn't care about us, and a lot of forces in the universe are out to get us, which the most prominent is, of course, disease, pathogens and parasites. And that brings us to the topic of this evening's event, what does the COVID-19 pandemic say about human progress? So I think the first thing we have to understand is that infectious disease is the rule in life, not the exception. All of us have been fortunate, at least in wealthy, developed countries, to not really worry that much about infectious disease until this year. We die of cancer, we die of heart attacks, we die of strokes. But for most of human history, people died of germs, of pathogens. And that's not unusual. That's the natural state of affairs. There's a poem by Augustus de Morgan. Great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum. From a germ's point of view, you and I are big, yummy mounds of chocolate cake there for the eating. For as long as there has been life, there have been little creatures who can evolve much faster than we can, who are very happy to devour us from the inside. And for most of human history, there have been devastating pandemics. A few examples, you can go to Wikipedia and look up pandemics, but in the late Roman Empire, the plague of Justinian killed 40 to 50% of Europe. The Black Death killed between 10 and 60% of Europe and ushered in the end of feudalism in the Middle Ages. The European colonization of the Americas led to probably 90% of the indigenous population, mainly from infectious disease. In the 19th century, a pandemic in India and China killed 12 million people. In the 20th century, smallpox killed 300 million. The Spanish flu 100 years ago killed 50 million. And even today, HIV/AIDS has killed probably about 32 million people since 1980. So far, COVID has killed almost 1 million. It will definitely be more. But we do have to put it into perspective that it's against the background in which we've kind of forgotten how devastating infectious disease can be. And in fact, many battles, many historical changes, many population flows have been shaped by the spread of infectious disease. Now, there's just no question that COVID-19 is going to set back progress. Many of the figures that I've mentioned, particularly life expectancy and poverty, are going to be a setback. We see it in the data on life expectancy from past pandemics. I remember when I first started doing research on violence, I saw a graph for life expectancy at birth in European countries for the 20th century, and went up like this. Then there was a big notch, and then it resumed and it went up again. And first I thought, oh my God, that's World War I. War is so devastating. And then I looked at the scale and I realized that wasn't World War I. That was the Spanish flu. Wars kill far fewer people in general than infectious disease. And even in wars, most of the people who die from disease rather than bullets and bombs. So the question is, if what I've been saying is true, if disease is always present with life, why aren't we all dead? And of course, the answer is in nature, there's a constant arms race. The bugs are out to kill us, and we're out to defend ourselves, to kill the bugs. So that's why we have an immune system. That's why we have sexual reproduction. Why do we waste half our offspring on boys when a race of all females would be much more logical? It would be women have what life needs, namely the ability to produce new life. Men don't. And the most likely answer is we evolved sex in order to make sure that our children are not clones of ourselves. And so they can stay one step ahead of the pathogens, the germs that are constantly evolving to crack our defenses. Psychologically, probably the emotion of disgust evolved as a defense against infection. The things that disgust us tend to be disease vectors, like bugs and rats and worms and bodily secretions. And it's possible that our xenophobia, our dislike of strangers, is a primitive defense against disease. Well, this is what brings us to progress, namely that we humans, because we're smart, because we can cooperate, we've developed new defenses against disease, namely reason and science and a concern for human welfare, humanism. And I argued in my book, Enlightenment Now, that this was the driver of progress. Given that progress doesn't occur by itself, it's highly unnatural, that's how we make progress happen. And infectious disease is perhaps our greatest success story. The reason that life expectancy went from 30 to 80 in developed countries is mainly because of sanitation and vaccination and antibiotics, because we fought back against the germs. And even in the developing world, in poor countries where infectious disease continues to be a major killer, there has been progress in all of the major infectious diseases, in pneumonia, in diarrhea, in malaria, in measles, in HIV/AIDS. All have shown progress, at least until this year. And again, there will be setbacks, tragically. This brings us to COVID-19. What are our prospects for dealing with this latest pandemic? Well, as it is dreadful, it is tragic, it will set back progress. But on the other hand, we've got to at least look at our current situation in comparison to earlier pandemics and disease threats. We identified the pathogen within days of the disease emerging. Scientists identified it's a virus. It was not the result of divine retribution or evil spirits or imbalance of humors or Jews poisoning the wells or foul-smelling gases and miasmas. Now, granted, there are conspiracy theories that it's caused by 5G cell phone towers and a plot by Bill Gates. And these conspiracy theories can be dangerous, but they are not embraced by any of our world's mainstream institutions. Within a week, the DNA sequence of the virus was established, just a scientific miracle. The spread was contained in many countries within months. So in your country and in mine, it makes comebacks. And currently about 160 vaccines are in development. If you think about how long it took to develop treatments for other historic devastating diseases, maybe about 3,000 years for smallpox and polio, about 350 years for rubella, 15 years for the first effective treatment for HIV, 5 years for Ebola. Within 4 months, there have been vaccine trials for COVID-19. So this is not to say that there will be a miracle. Progress is not a miracle. Is not to say that we can expect the pandemic to recede any day soon, or even that the vaccines will be cure-alls. We don't know how safe they will be. But knowing how our ancestors have made progress against the challenges that have threatened us, it impels us to double down on our efforts to make progress against this latest threat, to support the science, the knowledge, and the concern for universal human welfare that led to progress in the past.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Many interesting points to touch upon. But I wanted to start because I'm not sure whether everyone has read already your book, Enlightenment Now. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into what you just mentioned. Like, what do the values of the Enlightenment really add to human progress and the world we're living in now? What are the specific points, and why are they so relevant?
Yeah, of course, the Enlightenment wasn't a club, it wasn't a society, it didn't have a set of dogmas or an official set of beliefs. So I use the Enlightenment as just a loose term for 4 ideas, which are the subtitle of the book. Reason, the idea is that we should apply our rational faculties. You might say, well, doesn't everyone believe in reason? Well, not necessarily, because many people believe that we should base our beliefs on faith, on scripture, on charismatic leaders and authorities. Science is the second value that which is just applying reason to the world. Humanism, which is the moral conviction that our ultimate value should be the well-being of conscious creatures, namely particularly men, women, and children, but also animals. And again, you might say, well, isn't everyone a humanist? Is that really a thing? Do you have to even call attention to it? And the answer is we do, because there are alternative moral systems. There's the idea that morality consists of following religious commandments. There's the idea that it consists in glorifying the greatness and the preeminence of our nation or our race or our class. There's the idea that what we should value is the geniuses, the heroes, feats of greatness, not the peasants, the teeming masses of humanity. So humanism really is a distinct moral commitment. It's not natural. And the fourth idea that I identified was progress. Progress simply being what can happen if we apply reason and science to the goal of making people better off. So on the one hand, it sounds kind of obvious. On the other hand, I think it does have to be reaffirmed, because not everyone signs on to the Enlightenment. In particular, authoritarian populism and nationalism are counter Enlightenment movements and believe in many of the opposites of those Enlightenment ideals.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you just said, because when I'm hearing this, and I think when most of us are hearing this, this also doesn't sound very surprising, because that things have become better over time. That is quite obvious, actually, if you're looking at the world we're living in now. But nevertheless, you receive so many critiques, both from the left side of the political spectrum, as well as the right side of the political spectrum. And why would people disagree with you, you think?
Yes, so some of it just comes from disbelief, incredulity. What do you mean things have gotten better? Look at the war in Syria. Look at the famine in Yemen. Look at the toll that malaria continues to take. Look at Donald Trump. Look at the racial unrest in the United States. And these are all things that we have to be concerned with. But people, because our discussion, our talking points, our view of the world consists of news rather than data, people lose sight of the fact that progress can happen, has happened, and that we should ask why it's happened. So I think some people simply can't believe the actual facts. They don't agree that things are getting better. And if you read the news, things never get better. It's only when you look at data that you appreciate that things get better.
And what is the critique that struck you most?
Well, so just let me finish. I'll say another couple of words about your previous question, then I'll turn to this one. The left and the right do have reasons to, in addition to just not being appreciative of progress. For the left, the idea that our current institutions, our democratic government, regulated markets have actually made people better off. This goes against the idea that our institutions are deeply corrupt and have to be dismantled. From the right, a lot of people on the right kind of think the Enlightenment was a big mistake, that we were better off when we knew our place, when the church gave us our values, when we lived in small villages and knew each other and were not alienated. So modernity has its enemies on both the right and the left. Now, the other question is, what are the criticisms that have struck me, that is, that I agree with?
Yeah.
Well, I necessarily had to have a chapter in Enlightenment Now on the environment, and where one could argue correctly that in many ways we have not made progress. And I, in particular, have a section on climate change, a pretty long section, where I say we have not made progress. Things are getting worse. We are not doing what we have to do to avert a possible crisis. And again, the idea of progress doesn't mean that things get better by themselves, quite the opposite. Often solutions to problems create new problems, and greenhouse gases are our severest example. One of the reasons that countries get rich is they capture energy. The easiest way to capture energy over the last 200 years has been to burn fossil fuels. It's solved many problems. It's created a big problem. And so the challenge is, how do we get the benefits of abundant, cheap energy without destroying the atmosphere and the planet? Anyway, that is not something that where I have any regrets. In talking about other aspects of the environment, I talked about areas in which there's been progress, and indeed, in most developed countries, air has gotten cleaner, water has gotten cleaner. I probably could have spent more time on habitat loss, species extinctions, and other environmental problems. I think the idea that maybe I did not emphasize environmental risks in addition to climate change was fair.
Yeah, I think what is really interesting is that I saw a cartoon a few weeks ago with where you saw a sea, and the first wave was the COVID crisis, and the second bigger wave was the environmental crisis that we're facing. So I was wondering, how are you looking at? Do you see that also as a much bigger crisis, much bigger challenge to our future?
Oh, it is. I believe it is a much bigger challenge because COVID, I mean, judging both by what happened with past pandemics and what will very likely happen with COVID, namely there will be vaccines. We don't know how effective they will be. It won't be a magic cure. But in a couple of years, with a combination of vaccines, antiviral treatments, social distancing, and other measures, we'll be on top of it. It will fade into history. Climate is a much more severe crisis because it affects everything that we do, every light we turn on, every transportation decision we make, steel and cement and fertilizer and converting land from forest to cropland. Every aspect of life needs energy, and the transformation that we'll have to make is going to be a radical one. Now, I think that it's a solvable problem. I don't want to say that means that we will solve it, but we have to do the math. We have to acknowledge that energy is good, especially in the developing world, in big poor countries like India and Indonesia and China and Nigeria. They're going to want to get rich, and we should not stop them. And they're going to need lots of energy. The cheapest form of energy now is, for many of these countries, is coal, and that's a big problem. I think the general direction that we should take, and this is I understand is a controversial suggestion, but I am an advocate of nuclear power. I think that Sweden and France have done a much better job than Germany, for example. I think ultimately we will want a whole new generation of nuclear power, small modular reactors that can be made cheaply on an assembly line. But whatever works. If we have energy storage for solar and wind, if we have more geothermal, if we can recover more hydro power, although there's not that much left to recover, we need to throw everything at it. We need also new technologies for cement and for steel and for fertilizer. I think it can be done, but we really are not doing it enough. We also need policy changes. I think a carbon tax is essential. The great advantage of technological improvements, that is, if we were to, say, invent a small modular nuclear reactor that was safe, that could be mass produced on an assembly line, and if it was actually cheaper than coal, then we wouldn't need laws, we wouldn't need Greta Thunberg, we wouldn't need demonstrations, we wouldn't need controversy. People would just use it because it's cheaper, which means that it's much likelier to happen. And for similar reasons, whereas policies can be reversed, you can get a Donald Trump who pulls the United States out of the Paris Peace Agreement, but technology can't be uninvented. If you've got a cheap source of energy, you've got it. So that's the direction that I think we should go in, although we're not going in it enough yet.
Yes, if I'm listening to you and also reading this part of the book, I have the feeling that you are really positive about the fact that humans can actually fix the system. We can fix the environmental system and make it better. Is that a right interpretation? Can we really fix it?
I put it a little differently. I don't think we can fix it in the sense of getting everything we want, because you can't get everything you want. There are always trade-offs. If we had a perfectly clean environment, we would all be living in extreme poverty, which would be bad. If we would be dying at the age of 30 and never leaving our villages. But what we can do, I think, is bend the trade-off to get more prosperity with less environmental damage. And so I think that's where reason and science come in. So I don't think we can have a perfectly clean environment, just like you can't have a perfectly clean house. You don't want a perfectly clean house. You'd be spending all your time cleaning. But you do want a clean house, and we want a clean environment, clean enough. And that's what I think we we can and should aim at. And again, this is not a matter of, do I have an optimistic personality? No. It's looking at data. And I don't have data for Europe, but I suspect they're even better. But for the United States, since 1970, even though population has gone up and energy use has gone up and the number of miles people drive has gone up, but the major air pollutants have all gone down because of laws, because of technology. So it is possible to get improvement. It's not perfectly clean, and we ought to do better and more, but that's what we should be trying to do. We should not forget.
Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to a point you made earlier, which was about fear. And actually, listening to your keynote, I had the feeling that people are really fearful for the virus, for the pandemic. But what would you think is more dangerous, the fear for the virus, or the fear, or is the fear itself more dangerous for human progress?
Yes, as it was Franklin Roosevelt right when he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." No, I think we should fear the coronavirus. The optimal amount, that is, take measures that really minimize the risk of infection and contagion, not shut down everything everywhere, to the point of preventing people from taking a walk outside. But infectious disease is a real threat, and we really should be afraid of it, not in the sense of terrified, but cautious and finding out what the measures are that would reduce transmission and sticking with them.
So you wouldn't say that some people are showing an irrational fear for the virus?
I think that if we look at the adjustments to the pandemic, probably there have been more errors in not taking it seriously enough than in taking it too seriously. I think there have been both kinds of errors. Mm-hmm. But the experience of the United States in particular has shown that it's much more dangerous to underestimate the danger than to overestimate it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that many people also really have this fatalist feeling that this is really the moment that things are starting to change in a wrong direction. So people are so terrified to lose their jobs, lose their income. And is it even a possibility that the world is becoming poorer, is turning in the wrong direction, as opposed to all the facts and figures you showed in your book? Is that
well, yes,
an option?
And that is true. It is going in the wrong direction. This year, if we look at poverty, if we look at lifespan, it will almost certainly be going in the wrong direction. And that happens. It happened in the past, and it will happen in the future. But it won't. I don't think it's as if it will go back to dying at 30. We're going back to, say, 1/3 of children dying in their first year of life. 1% of mothers dying in childbirth. I don't think it'll be reversed, but there will be a setback. We don't know how low, and we don't know when it will go back up, and we don't know what the damage will be. I think it's reasonable to expect that it will be a temporary setback and that progress will resume, but not automatically. That will happen only if we take measures, just as the progress in the past did not happen by itself. It happened because sanitation was invented, and because markets were developed, and because vaccines were invented. Progress is real, but it's very unnatural. It comes about through, what I've called Enlightenment values.
And you stated already that policies are really important as well. And which countries or which politicians do you see as good examples in this crisis?
Well, a lot of countries have made mistakes, and a lot of scientists have made mistakes, and we should expect that, because scientists and leaders are not oracles, they're not prophets. Our natural state is ignorance. We just, when something appears like the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we knew nothing. And so it was inevitable that there would be mistakes, and we didn't know how easily it was transmitted, whether people without symptoms could transmit it. And so I think we should not ridicule the leaders who made mistakes, although we can criticize them if they are not learning from data and from other countries' experience. Well, we know that certainly island nations like Taiwan and New Zealand had effective measures, but they also, of course, had the advantage that they were islands. Yeah. I think a number of the nations of East Asia, like South Korea, and partly because of their past experience with SARS and other infectious diseases, but they had an infrastructure that was ready. And one of the things that I think that the world needs is to treat pandemics the way we treat fires in cities. We have a fire department. They spend a lot of their time sitting around doing nothing. They've put themselves out of a job. Most fire departments just break down doors for when someone has a heart attack. There are very few fires anymore in Western cities. But we spend the money because if a fire happens, it can be devastating. And we should have at the ready detection networks for new pandemic threats. They will exist. Manufacturing facilities that can be geared up quickly to develop viruses, new generation of antiviral drugs, networks for tracing and testing. It costs money that in a lot of years is going to seem like it's wasted, but in the same way that having a fire department seems like it's wasteful until a fire happens. Some of the countries of Western Europe have, I think, have done certainly better than the United States has done. Not a great example. There's of course a lot of controversy over Sweden's policy. I don't think we know yet. We need good quantitative analyses of which policies brought the infection rate down fastest with the fewest deaths. Sweden's death rate now is quite low, but to get here, an awful lot of people died. And probably Norway, in many ways similar, had a better response. Mm-hmm. But I think we should use countries as a lab. That's the only lab we have, and to have good quantitative social scientists try to figure out what works, what doesn't.
And do you have the idea that politicians are listening enough to scientists at the moment?
Depends on the politicians. I can think of one politician who has not listened nearly enough.
No, indeed. But your overall view is that experts are being heard in the crisis.
Experts have an enormous amount of respect. So in the United States, implausibly, an 80-year-old infectious disease specialist, Anthony Fauci, is now our biggest hero. Mm-hmm. Not universally, of course, there are, and you raised the question at the very beginning, what are the psychological responses that have gotten in the way? And the biggest psychological problem has not been ignorance or illiteracy, but a big one has been political polarization. The fact that in the United States in particular, the COVID response was politicized very early, and people on the Trumpian right, people on the left had each one assumed the other one had to be wrong, mm-hmm. And not wearing masks, deliberately going out in crowded indoor spaces became a kind of loyalty badge for the American right with tragic results. This is sheer irrationality. I mean, this was an example of how the worst in human nature, in this case, tribalism, demonization, got in the way of other parts of human nature that could be more rational.
What I also found really interesting, following up to this point you make, is that you stated in an interview with the New York Times that norms and institutions make us collectively more rational than any of us is individually. And I find it so interesting because I have the feeling that institutions, and especially in the US under Trump, are actually being under threat. And he is feeding distrust in the institutions, in the media, and in politics. Is this also, will this make people more irrational in the end? And how dangerous is this?
I think it is a real danger because I think you put your finger on it. As a psychologist, as someone who believes there is such a thing as human nature, including many irrational, ugly, nasty parts, in some ways I'm an unlikely advocate for progress because I really do believe we are not blank slates. We are not a tabula rasa. We really are equipped with a lot of dysfunctional psychological processes. But we also have better angels, as Abraham Lincoln put it. And what institutions can do is try to bring out our better angels, partly just even through conflict, through processes where one person's ego can't lead to a mass delusion because other people will criticize them. So we have in democratic governments, we have checks and balances. The courts can oppose the legislature can oppose the chief executive. In science, we have peer review. You can't just publish anything you want. Other scientists get to attack you. Mm-hmm. In journalism, we've got editing and fact-checking and freedom of the press. In the court system, we have the adversarial system. It seems that when you have open criticism and debate, you can get people moving toward rationality. If it's just a powerful, charismatic person imposing his will, then you can get all of the craziness that comes with being human. Mm-hmm. And yes, so in answering your question, the attacking institutions like the press, like international organizations like the European Union and World Health Organization and United Nations, the universities, the state. One of Trump's targets is the so-called deep state. That is, people who are not political, who will have responsibilities. All of these institutions, as you suggested, are what allow us to be smarter than any one of us is individually, and it is a problem, I think, when they are undermined. Of course, they always have to be reformed. Our institutions always have flaws, but they're better than anarchy.
I read also in an interview that you stated after your book was published that all this progress is threatened if Donald Trump gets his way, and I think that was quite. Did you really mean it? Or don't
I think a lot was, and a lot has been. So, an obvious example would be, in the United States at least, the results of the COVID pandemic. That the figures like life expectancy in the United States are going to get worse because of a leader who did not respect the best science. Mm-hmm. Progress against climate change, the fact that the United States withdrew from Paris and has gutted many laws that protect the atmosphere, that means that things will get worse. So yes, I think now, fortunately, Donald Trump is not the king of the world. And so it doesn't mean the whole world will get worse, but there absolutely is damage. And again, it reinforces, I think, the main point of this evening's conversation, which is progress can occur, but it is not automatic. It's not natural. Mm-hmm. There are threats. Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious because you also state that progress comes from the fact that people can imagine another world, and that this belief in something different is really important in order to make progress happen. And I was wondering, we see a lot of movements coming up throughout the world, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, environmental movements such as Extinction Rebellion, for example. Do these kind of movements help in the idea of human progress, according to you?
They would. They do by identifying the right goals. That is obviously racial equality, minimization of violence by the state, including the police, dealing with greenhouse gases before they cause damage to our lives. I don't think that the methods that they advocate are going to solve the problems that they have identified.
Why not?
I don't think in the United States, say, defunding the police is going to save Black lives or anyone's lives, although reforming the police would. I don't think dismantling the system will make us better off. I think it would make us worse off, although I think improving the system could make us better off. In the case of climate, I don't think that calling on the world to eliminate economic growth, to go back to a simpler lifestyle, to have more organic farming, those won't solve the problem. Although the problem they identify is a problem we have to deal with. The problem, I think, to deal with these problems, we need an analysis of what is the source of the problem and reforms that are targeted at making at lessening the problem. Technology in the case of climate and policy, like carbon taxes, reform in police practices in the United States policing system.
Mm-hmm. So we would need another kind of movements or another kind of solutions, according to you?
Yes, it may be that in some cases there's a kind of division of labor, that there's some very emotional movements that supply some of the passion, but then cooler heads that take an analytic approach and say, well, they don't have the solution, but they've identified some problems. Let's see what the solutions are.
Mm-hmm. All right. I wanted to see if there is any questions here from the audience here in the room. I see a few hands raising, so I'm coming to you.
Well, hello. Thank you, Mr. Pinker. My name is Edward, and I was wondering, in the Netherlands we have a population of 17 million people, and just before COVID, the number of people who applied for professional mental health every year is 20% of our population. 1.2 million people are chronic depressants and are hooked on antidepressant medicine. How do you explain that in a frame that we are also one of the happiest countries in the world?
Yeah, so are the data that you're referring to since the emergence of the COVID pandemic?
The data is from Jim van Os. Jim van Os is a professor of psychiatry in Utrecht.
No, but the timing.
It was just before last winter, so it was before the COVID.
Yeah, so overall, so the number of people who are using mental health services is not itself an indication of the prevalence of mental distress and mental illness, because it could mean that the mental health establishment is making itself more available, that there are more mental health workers, that their services are more accessible, that there's less stigma, and so more people are seeking help. In general, so it's very hard to measure the actual prevalence of mental disorders and distress for that reason, that how many people take drugs, how many people get mental health indicates more about the mental health profession than it does about incidence. The best figures that I have seen from the global health metrics suggest that over the last 30 years, there's been very little change in the actual incidence of psychological disorders. And in the case of the possibly the worst kind of disorder, namely suicide, the rates have gone down globally by a lot, by about 40%, although not in every country. The United States, they've gone up a bit. If there has been, well, I don't have to say if, we know for a fact there has been an increase in distress and anxiety and depression since the COVID pandemic, but it would be shocking if there weren't. Things really have gotten worse, and people are upset, and if they weren't upset, that would mean they were not dealing with a genuine stressor. So that shouldn't surprise us. It's the recent increase in anxiety, depression that's what anxiety and depression are for. They're to deal with genuine threats, and this is a genuine threat. And so part of that will resolve itself if and when dealing with the pandemic is successful.
Just maybe a follow-up question to this, because could it also be the case that if you look at other indicators, such as, for example, the way that people are feeling or their mental health, could that paint another picture of the world we live in?
Well, it is something that we ought to look at, because ultimately, all of these improvements, if they don't make people happier, then can you really call it progress? And I deal with that in the book. And to some extent, by the way, the answer is yes, because there are ways in which when we become more mature, more aware, more adult, we can become less happy because we are more aware of real problems. Children in general are not as anxious as adults, but they have a lot less to worry about. And as we get more socially conscious, more environmentally conscious, we've got more weighing on us. So to some extent, some degree of anxiety may be inevitable for a world that is more aware of problems, and that's something that we have to develop ways of coping with. But in terms of overall subjective well-being, just how well do you judge your life? It's gone down this year. It should go down this year. If it wasn't, people would be deluded. Life has gotten worse. But the overall trend in most countries has been upward. Majority of countries, people report that they are happier than they were 30 and 40 years ago. Not every country, but a majority. And as I mentioned, rates of suicide have come down by a lot. Again, not everywhere.
Yeah, well, you paint a very prosperous world, but the numbers I just mentioned, isn't it also a sign that this prosperous world on an individual basis is showing that people are less able to deal with setbacks?
Yeah, so it is an interesting question whether we have become less resilient. And when we look at our, well, at least for you and me, our parents and our grandparents and what they lived through, in the Netherlands, in the Eastern Europe, World War, Depression, Holocaust, Cold War with the threat of nuclear annihilation. It is interesting that today it does seem that our expectations have risen, and so smaller setbacks might have a greater effect on us. In that sense, we don't have good data on that. I have a student at Harvard University who is studying that for his thesis. Have we become less resilient? I don't know the answer, but it is possible. As our lives get better, we don't worry about aggressions. We worry about microaggressions. In a way, that's a kind of progress, but ideally, we would be both resilient and have better lives.
First of all, Professor Pinker, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate this. I have a question. I don't mean to catch you off guard with this, but I understand that a group of students, also PhD academics and professors, tried to cancel you, I think, a couple of months back. And along with, I think, J.K. Rowling, I believe it was Francis Fukuyama, other academics, there was a letter signed, I think, to decry cancel culture in general. Knowing the extent that it has come today, what do you think you or anybody in your field in kind of high-ranking academia could have done in hindsight to prevent the extent of cancel culture that it has become today?
Well, I think that there has to be more pushback, and I think the main the leaders in that have to be leaders in universities and institutions, particularly the press. That I think all too often university presidents and deans have laid themselves down and worshipped the most ridiculous and irrational demands of students and other protesters. One famous example was at Yale University when my friend Nicholas Christakis, a brilliant sociologist, epidemiologist, physician, and the master of one of the houses, was obscenely berated by a student because his wife wrote an article that students should chill out about Halloween costumes. Now, the response from the president of the university should have been, it's fine for you to disagree. It's not fine for you to scream and swear and hurl obscenities. There should be standards of how people can disagree. I believe that he responded badly. He kind of kissed up to the student, said, it's so great that she was expressing her pain and her hurt. This was nuts. And it led to, I think, a decline in the prestige of universities and an increase in the entitlement, the feeling that if you are upset about anything, then you get to shut someone else down. Mm-hmm. So I think there are other horror stories that have come from the press, like the New York Times, where they fired the editor of the editorial page because he ran an editorial by an American senator that actually expressed a view that a majority of Americans agree with, but that the Times staffers felt uncomfortable with. What they should have done is print a rebuttal in the same page, but instead they fired the editor. So we certainly need people to speak out at all levels, but I think a lot of the energy has to come from people with a position of power and responsibility, editors, deans, presidents.
And if we look at this specific letter that was mentioned, was about racial insensitivity, and you were accused of using certain words that you should not have used. And I was wondering, what did it do to you personally? Because you're a linguist, and I'm wondering, do you use your words in a different way now?
Well, I generally don't, because I've always chosen my words carefully. The idea, I think that some of the accusations in this letter were preposterous. The idea that urban crime is somehow a dog whistle or a code word for racial crime is just a fantasy. It's just, and it's ironic, of course, that linguists of all people were not looking at the meaning of words in context, where I used urban crime the same way that the author of the article that I tweeted used urban crime, namely crime that takes place in cities. So no, I'm not going to be more careful about using words in the way that any charitable person would interpret them in context. If someone is determined to create enemies out of thin air by hallucinating meanings into their words that no ordinary person would read, that's something that I can't defend myself against by changing my language. What I can do is point out how that is dishonest and irrational. Mm-hmm.
But I can imagine that this also has an effect on much more people that have the feeling that they can say anything they want to say. To what extent is freedom of speech under threat in the US, for example, now?
I think it is under threat, particularly in arenas where it ought to be celebrated and encouraged. In academia, the reason that we have universities is so that people can explore ideas. Not everyone is right all the time. No one is infallible. Everyone is going to say things that can be and ought to be disagreed with or criticized. But it's in the universities where a very, very narrow range of opinion is being enforced. Not everywhere and not completely, otherwise I wouldn't still have a job. But I think it is a problem. And likewise, I think it's a problem in the press. I think that our best newspapers have to be arenas in which differences of opinion can be expressed and aired. Yeah. Now, again, freedom of speech, of course, has limits, even in the United States, which probably is the most aggressive country in defending free speech. say, compared to many European countries. In the United States, hate speech is protected by the Constitution. You cannot be, it is against the laws of the government of the United States for the government to punish someone for hate speech. That's not true in many European countries. Even there, though, even in the United States, there are limitations. There's incitement to violence, there's extortion, there's libel and slander. Many of the cases in which free speech have arisen have not been anything like those. They have been cases where probably people have been advocating ideas that are probably true. And they have been canceled, censored, fired. We don't know that they're true because you can't know that anything is true until you say it and criticize it. But the things that have been censored are things that are not libelous, they are not incitements to violence. Quite the contrary, they might very well be true. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, there's another question here.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you again for joining us today. I have a question about China. And so if you look over the last 50 years, a lot of the improvements we've seen in global condition has happened in China. They've risen hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And my question is, do you think that also poses a counter-argument to the theory that humanism is one of the leading drivers of doing this? And does this pose a risk to creating a kind of an example for other countries to follow rather than the democratic one?
Yeah, it's a very good question because China has, since the death of Mao, it has embraced some of the Enlightenment themes like markets, like some degree of individual freedom compared to the Maoist era. Chinese citizens can move, they can wear what they want. What they can't do is criticize the government. And indeed, humanism certainly is not universally embraced in China. The treatment of the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority, the treatment of the Tibetans, the treatment of political dissidents are deeply non-humanist. There is in China a strong nationalist ethnic bias for ethnic Han Chinese. On the other hand, there is, compared to the Maoist era, and probably compared to many of the imperial eras in China, the government has dedicated itself to improving the well-being of its citizens as opposed to just national glory. Now, that may be shifting, but the Chinese government has tried to make its citizens as wealthy as possible. So it's not exactly humanism. It's not humanism. It's more humanistic than other periods in Chinese history, and it will pose a challenge as to how far that model can succeed in when the Chinese population becomes even more affluent, better educated, when they demand access to the rest of the world, as affluent people always do, whether there will be pressure for it to become more universally humanistic. I would not predict that that's going to happen, but it is at least a possibility.
It is, of course, quite controversial, but I saw a newspaper article last week that China is aiming to become a climate neutral state in 2050. And that is, of course, much easier if you don't have a democratic state. What do you think of this?
Well, it's not the case that dictatorships have better environmental records. The worst emitter of greenhouse gases in the history of the world was Maoist China. In terms of emissions per unit of wealth generated, because during the Great Leap Forward, there were these backyard smelters that had zero economic output with massive emissions from coal. So I think it is, I would have a narrower conclusion, which is that governments that set themselves the goal of improving the climate will be more successful than those that don't set themselves the goal, whether they're democratic or autocratic.
All right.
Yeah, on the topic of cancel culture, mental health, low resilience, Do you think that safety culture, since maybe the 90s, I know there's the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which talks about the stories that we tell our children, how we treat our children. Do you think that's kind of a link to all this? Do you think that has brought up a generation who are less resilient to opposing opinion, who are more scared, more anxious maybe, and this is a factor in cancel culture?
It's an interesting idea. You're right that this was identified by two people that I respect enormously, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, in the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. I've come to think that that's not the main cause, that the people who prosecute cancel culture, they're not hurt, they're not weepy, they're not depressed, they are aggressive, and that they're using the rhetoric of hurt and harm in order to prosecute others. They're more like people who hire a lawyer to press a lawsuit for personal injury and have to emphasize how much pain and suffering they've gone through than people who have been genuinely traumatized. I think a better analysis, and it's one that Jonathan Haidt himself has also found interesting, comes from a pair of sociologists, Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning, where they talk about the culture of victimhood that I think is a main driver of cancel culture, which is that in contrast to, say, a previous generation in which the sign of moral worth was the ability to withstand stress and pain and insults, a culture in which a mature person was one who could laugh off criticism and insults, then it's a new culture in which the way you gain moral status is by reporting infractions to third-party bureaucrats, to the dean, to the diversity officer, and that I'm wondering how much they are literally psychologically damaged or whether they are part of a culture in which this can be used as a weapon.
I'm just looking around to see if there's any questions. Oh, there was a follow-up question here.
How would you then differentiate safety culture from a culture of victimhood? Maybe they're not the same, but it seems like in my mind at least they could be pretty related.
Yeah, I think they are related. I think the difference would be whether the people who are prosecuting the cancellations, the disinvitations, the censuring, are in genuine psychological distress, or are they, or have they just woven this into part of their belief system? Are we seeing the responses of someone who's depressed? Are they more likely to be on antidepressants, to be unable to get out of their room, to get out of bed, to enjoy things in life? Or is it that they are just political activists who have a platform? With other activists, it could be other forms of grievance and injustice, and that's the one that has been woven into this ideology. And the answer could be, you're right, but the answer could be both. It could be that the lack of resilience that I mentioned earlier in response to another question could help to feed and to be translated into a political agenda. I can't stand being criticized, it hurts my feelings, and so I'm going to use this to punish the people who disagree with me. So you're right that it could be some of each.
Mm-hmm. But there might also be some people who say this just comes from an idea of a lack of attention for the real problems that these people are facing, such as racism, for example. What would you respond to them?
Well, I'm skeptical of that simply because many of the people that they attack are by no stretch of the imagination racists, and the attacks are going to do absolutely nothing to improve the well-being of racial and sexual and ethnic minorities. They don't consist of careful analyses of the sources of racial disparities, which are not all racism, even though that is the current dogma. But there are cultural differences. No two cultures are identical, And even though it's become a bit of a taboo, it wasn't a taboo 10 or 20 years ago, but it's become a taboo to look at different cultural patterns. There are other sources of disparity, such as policies, unjust policies, and their residue, partly through culture. But the idea that the only reason that there are differences is because of racism is a kind of religion that I don't think helps us in understanding how to get what we all want, which is fairness and racial equality.
Thank you so much. I wanted to end maybe, hopefully, on a more on a positive note, actually. And what I found really interesting to read is that you said once you stopped reading the headlines and started reading scientific papers, the world became a much better place for you, or at least your idea of the world became much more positive. And what would you advise the people who are here in the room, the people who are watching online for the future? What could they do in addition to this advice?
Well, I certainly could not advise avoiding the headlines. You can't do that. And I wish I could, but I don't avoid the headlines. But it should be supplemented with a consumption of other and more longer-term, more sources of information, one that provide more perspective, so that you're not constantly being assaulted every day by the worst headlines. I'm a big fan of Our World in Data, ourworldindata.org, a website out of the University of Oxford, which has an astonishing set of data. And one of the miracles is that when the COVID crisis hit, they became possibly the best source in the world for information about COVID almost instantly. But even before they did that, there's a place to go to see, well, how bad is war? How bad is oppression of women? How bad is child labor? And almost any question you ask about the world, you can find an answer there that will be more accurate than what did I read in the news this morning. You can also supplement it with, there are now a number of new feeds, Twitter feeds and websites for sources that try to report the underreported positive developments. Now, not because they just want to put a smile on people's faces, but because they recognize that many positive developments just won't make the news because they consist of nothing happening, or of things that are so gradual that there's never a Thursday in October in which all of a sudden it happens. It kind of creeps up. One of them was founded by the talking head leader, David Byrne. Right? He has a website and feed called Reasons to be Cheerful. There's another one that comes out of Australia called Future Crunch, which I highly, highly recommend. It's just amazing, the number of developments, species that have been saved from extinction, declines in pollution, laws that discriminate against gay people that have been repealed, reductions in disease and poverty, so Future Crunch. And in the UK, there's a magazine called Positive News. So these are all ways in which, again, you don't want to be unaware of bad things. You don't want to be optimistic so much as you want to be accurate. And the problem is that reading headlines are systematically inaccurate because they report things that happen suddenly, which usually are bad. But there are things that happen gradually and that without photographs, without a lot of noise, that are good, that you tend to miss unless you go to these alternative sources of information.
I would like to thank you very, very much for your contribution this evening. I hope we can all go out of the room with a more, not an optimistic, not only a positive view, but a more complete view of the current situation we're in and also the future and our position in this. Thank you very much, Steven Pinker. You might want to give him an applause, although he's online. And thank you, and thanks as well to the people who are watching from home. I would like to wish you a very nice evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thanks to all of you. Thanks for your questions.